Aha, there, you're recording, Dan. Thank you. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to this CCS seminar. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shona Mortier. I direct the Center for Civil Society. Today, we have a seminar titled Democratic Organization and Organizing, International Examples and Lessons. And today, I am really very thrilled to introduce the speaker, who is the wonderful Dale McKinley. And Dale has a long history as a public intellectual and activist in South Africa. He's played a critical role in the South African social movement space, as well as in community struggles, and before that in the liberation movement. And I think he has very keen insights, and he has been involved in some of the most critical spaces for social justice in this country before the transition to democracy, as well as after. And today he is going to be speaking to us about organizing and organization. He is currently based at the International Labour Research and Information Group, ILRIG, which is committed to research, education, training, and the production of popular materials for labour and community movements in South and Southern Africa. And as we know, it's within these movement spaces where critical transformation happens. So the kind of work that Dale is doing is critical work that will defend our democracy, promote social justice and transformation, not just in South Africa, but also on the continent and in the region. So I'm going to turn over now to Dan. Dale, welcome. Very much looking forward to your presentation. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Shona.
Thank you, Shona. Thanks, Dale, for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your critique of the current conditions of the civil society. And I'll give you 30 to 40 minutes to give your presentation, and then after that we will engage with the audience through a question and answer section. And the audience can also give comments. You can drop your comments in the chat box, and then we can attend to that comment. Please keep your videos off, but Dale, you can keep yours on, it's fine. And then keep your mics on mute. And if you want to be recognized during the question and answer session, please do that by showing the virtual hand. So Dale, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time. You can begin your presentation or your talk.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Shona, for that very gracious introduction. I just consider myself a veteran these days, even though that's sometimes hard to grapple with. But time does move on, and it's always amazing to think that some of us have already, since the beginning of this transition, we have already been involved for over 3 decades in these struggles of various sorts. So I think I'm going to try to be I'm not one of those that gives very flashy PowerPoint presentations and lots of graphics and pictures and all sorts of other things. I certainly just sort of like to be a bit old-fashioned in this sense and speak directly to all of you in this case. And what I'm going to do today, and the reason why I chose this, I think it's even more appropriate given what is the elections that have just finished here in our own country, and what was on offer in those elections. The untold story of these elections, just to say, by the way, is the no vote, which got the #1 vote. The no vote was about 41% of the entire eligible voting population. Or in most cases, even with the registered. And that's an indication that a large section of our population has completely lost trust in the political system, in political parties that are there, that has opted out, some for particular political and other reasons, some because they felt there was no choice. But I think the real import of this is that, and what I'm going to talk about today, is that much of the organization and much of the forms of organization that are offered and on offer in the political space, in the social space as well, are in many ways not speaking, I don't think, to what is needed right now and what people are looking, particularly a younger generation, which is not weighed down by the historical baggage that oftentimes my generation and many others have been in relation to the old left, should we say, or the old forms of that left. And I think that's part of the challenge that I want to address, is that I believe that a large section, and certainly not all, but a large section of what we would consider to be the left side of the political spectrum or the progressive forces in our country are stuck in the past, in terms of organizational forms, as well as the way in which one goes about building that movement and that organization. I want to talk about this not in the sense of trying to point fingers or to be in sectarian at all, because that's in part of the problem. It's to be self-reflective and to look at things that have been tried and are not particularly working very well, and then also to look at two specific international examples that are at present being implemented as we speak. And this, I think, is ILRIG has always been 40 years of ILRIG now from last year, has always been very strong on looking at international struggles and international examples and trying to learn from those. And I think that's another area which we have become fairly weak in relation to South African progressive forces, is not paying as much attention as we should to things that are happening in other parts of the world that provides us with serious inspiration, lessons, and possibilities, new possibilities. So that's just a general background to what I'm going to talk. Let me just present the problem, or what I see as the conundrum in some ways here in terms of the democratic organizations on the left or the progressive side of the spectrum in South Africa. I think largely the South African left and the progressive forces are stuck in a mode of vanguardism, are stuck in a mode where we think, or largely think, that if we simply put together a movement or political party or announce it, that we put together a political program or a manifesto or some kind of guidelines, and then we sell these things to people, that we have the answers. And this has always been a tradition within parts of the left, internationally as well, but I think it has been particularly strong in South Africa, where we've had a situation where we believe that if we have this kind of, this program or these answers, and it's just a question of convincing people to join the party or the movement based upon those things. The problem with this fundamentally, of course, is that it's usually a fairly small group of people. It's those group of people that seem to think that they've got it all worked out already, because they've done all of the homework, the theoretical work, they put together the program. And it's just a question of going out and through propaganda, through publicity, through mobilizing, and trying to convince people that this is the way to go. And they must therefore join us or vote for us or join our movement or organization. And this will be the way to be, how should we say, anti-systemic, anti-capitalist, fighting the system. This is the way to change things fundamentally. I think that is the one side of the problem, or the challenge that we face in South Africa, is that we still have this this way of operating. And what links with that is what I call big man politics, which is that we have leaders that I think many South Africans and many in our region in particular are still taken with the big man notion of the big leader. That there are these leaders that are up there, and these leaders must be followed, and they're the ones that should speak on our behalf, and that oftentimes are cults of personality, very sizable egos, oftentimes are generated as a result of this. And so this is often also then created situations where people are oftentimes building these organizations and these struggles around themselves in many cases, or around particular personalities, around particular leaders. And those leaders get elevated to a sort of level above the people, above the mass, above the normal membership. And then that speaks to the third component of the problem in terms of democratic or lack, should I say, in some cases of democratic organization, is then when the organization itself gets built or gets put into place. Instead of that being a much more organic process, a bottom-up process of where people are trying to create things that are controllable, that are accountable, that are ultimately very, very democratic, what we often have, and I think what we're stuck in, is a mode of forms of organization that are very hierarchical, where, you know, almost whether it's your local community organization, your political party, your social movement, there's the structure. There's the president, there's the general secretary, there's the deputy general secretary, there's the treasurer, there's these positions, the office bearers, the exco, whatever you want to call them. And immediately when that is happened, this leadership collective or this collective of knobs or whatever we want to call them, whether you're in the union movement, in the political party movement, in social movements, or whatever the case might be, almost immediately what that does is it sets certain people above others. It sets them above in terms of their positionality, oftentimes even in NGOs, where it's in civil society, where you have people that then it becomes a difference according to pay grades. And this is, you know, you can see it in government, you can see it every single place. There's these hierarchy. And what that basically then inculcates is a sense that certain people are more important than others. Certain people have a better position than others because of their title or because of how much they earn or whatever the case might be. And this oftentimes is very, very antithetical in many ways to a truly democratic organization, democratic movement. And oftentimes that opens the door, although it doesn't always happen, but it can open the door to gatekeeping, to people abusing those positions or taking advantage of them, to manipulating membership to where people can then be expelled or they can be pushed aside as a result of this collective that then is given this executive power. And oftentimes even constitutions and of organizations are written around these hierarchies. Very much so. Now, that's not to say that organizations shouldn't be able to have structures and shouldn't be able to have leaders. There might be people who are strong in particular leadership ways or doing things. It's the way in which these organizations are built and the sort of a priori or in some ways sort of assumption that you can't have an organization that's flat. You can't have an organization that is horizontal. You can't have an organization, even though we say in our politics that we want everyone to be equal. We want society to be equal. We don't want class structures to be determining what you can do. We tend to replicate these very things in our own organizations, even sometimes unwittingly. And maybe it's in many cases it's not a planned thing, but in other cases it's very planned and it's very much inculcated into a culture of having these levels of leadership and levels of hierarchies in organizations that are not exactly oftentimes the most democratic, and oftentimes can lead to a whole range of conflicts and tensions. And I think this is what I'm talking about is not theoretical. This has been borne out in 30 years in South Africa of the experience of many left movements. And when I say left, I mean the broadest sense possible, whether that's in the union sector, workers, communities, civil society, whatever the case might be. Again, there are exceptions, but I think as a general view, this has been very, very prevalent, and the bottom line is that what these have contributed to, these top-down approaches, this sort of isolationism that we have all the answers. It's just a question of going about the internal dealing with internal debates and differences and other kinds of things, have often resulted in left organizations destroying themselves or weakening themselves. I mean, we have a litany of social movements that arose in the late 90s and early 2000s, which are no longer with us. And there are explanations as to why they're no longer with us. One of those explanations, certainly not the only one, but one of the contributing explanations is what we're talking about now, is the lack of democratic organization, creative ways of going about building those movements and having these sort of power relations and unequal power relations oftentimes inculcated within the structure and in the form of the movement. And oftentimes that's reflected then in the politics. I'm oftentimes very, very taken aback these days at how progressive and left comrades and forces can oftentimes feel worse towards each other than they do towards the class enemy, or treat each other very badly, or attack each other in ways that are almost like you're my total enemy. You know, despite the fact that the disagreement might be fairly minimal, it might be an ideological disagreement, it might be a strategic disagreement. And so therefore, debate and dissent oftentimes gets shifted into very, very sort of formalized ways of dealing with things, as opposed to having open spaces for that debate and those differences to be thought out and talked about in a very democratic way. So those are the challenges in I would say in a nutshell, and there are many, many more that I could talk about, but I'm just trying to in a very short space of time. So what are the kinds of what are some of the maybe alternatives or some of the things that we can look at internationally right now as we speak that would give us a different kind of sort of, you know, setup and a different examples? There are many. There are some in our own history, but I wanted to take two that are very current right now. And the first one I wanted to talk about is, and I'm only going to be able to do this very briefly, but those of you who might not know, there's a small city, a small town in Mexico called Cheran. It's in northwestern Mexico. And this is a city that, just to give you a little bit of background, back in about 1520, in the early 2000s, just like most cities around the world have been badly affected by all the neoliberal policies, job losses, lack of basic services. In their cases, there was it was an agriculturally based town and small scale farmers, and many became unemployed and so forth and so on. They also then had drug gangs who came into the town and began to take over land and started growing avocados, which were a very big source of income for the gangs, and started cutting down a lot of the forests and other kinds of things. Long story short is that after many years of this, where the gangs were essentially running the show in conjunction with corrupt politicians, that the community decided that's it, we've had enough. And in around 2005, they had a people's revolt. And when we say revolt, basically without any arms, without any kind of you know, military training or anything like this, they rose up in a peaceful way on a particular night when their church bells were rang and thousands of people came out, and they managed to kick out. I'm not going to go through the whole story. They managed to kick out all the drug gangs. They managed to basically take back the community and the town, armed with everything from fireworks to some Molotov cocktails that they try to defend themselves with. But the main story is what they've done since over the last 15 years. And they have managed to, in the last 15 years, to create a truly flat structure of assemblies, of people's assemblies. And this goes back to what, in some cases, was being experimented with in the 80s here, in street committees and people's assemblies and people's power, when South African activists and the left very took seriously the notion that we didn't have to have a central state that was running everything, that we didn't have to have leaders that were up here, that people themselves could deal with things, people themselves could organize, people themselves could begin to engage in running the administrative and other practical measures of what people needed. In Cheran, what they've done is they have street level committees that run the town permanently. And basically it's a collection of assemblies. And everybody has the right to speak, everybody has the right to vote, everybody can come into these assemblies. Those assemblies then discuss and decide how services should be provided, how services should be maintained. So for example, local schools, healthcare facilities are linked to those assemblies. Each of the member contributes labor time and sources. Nobody is given any particular money for this. It's a volunteer, but then they decide who to hire in the community to do the basic things that needed to be done. In other words, all of those that would need to run the water system or to run the school system or whatever it is in the town. They have, in their case, they have banned political parties from this space because they believe that political parties are simply just about gaining power from the top and basically taking power away from people. And so the assemblies then represent the community, not the parties. They have organized themselves they've organized self-protection, they've organized a whole range of other kinds of things. It's amazing. In the 12 years that they've been organizing, there's virtually no crime in the entire city. This is a city now of about 20,000 people, even though it's a small scale. The healthcare is accessible. Water is provided to everybody free. They have managed to basically run an entire city on the basis of truly democratic participatory processes. And they've also then built a communal economy. So in order to have income generation, in order to be able to have people, they've used the collective to start communes that have a reforestation commune and using the forest as a means of income as well. A nursery, one about also a sawmill and other kinds of things they've done in relation to agriculture and so forth. I can't mention all of these things. But the point here is that Tehran, even if it's a small-scale example, demonstrates that a different kind of politics based on people's power, direct democracy, horizontalism, no leadership, no political parties, in this case of formalized, can actually work, whether that's on a local and other scale. The second example I'm going to mention is what has been happening in Rojava. For those of you who don't know what Rojava is the area of northeastern Syria that is where a revolutionary experiment has been taking place for many years. This was an area after when the Syrian civil war started, where collectives of mostly Kurdish women and men fought ISIS and fought the Assad regime in Syria and created an autonomous zone in northeastern Syria that they call Rojava, and have been trying to build a completely alternative society that they call democratic confederalism in that society. And they're continuing to do this as we speak. They're under massive attack by the right-wing government from Turkey, from Assad, from other forces. But they have been trying very incredibly bravely and courageously, not just to hold back the forces of reaction in the right wing, but also to build something completely egalitarian, direct democracy, that is both, by the way, and all of these elements are both, they call them, they're ecologically sensitive as well. So it's not just about, having structures and democratic structures and communal systems, but also that are trying to deal with issues of climate change and environmental legacies that have been left behind of destruction. I don't have the time to go into we've produced as ILRIG quite a lot of material on Rojava. We've had 3 different exchanges. We're going to be having, by the way, another exchange where 3 more comrades are coming out to South Africa to talk about their experiences and others on this. So trying to allow people to learn from these things. But fundamentally, what has happened in Rojava is they have built a democratic confederalist system which starts at the bottom. It starts with street committees and community neighborhood councils, where everybody can get involved in these things at the basic level, and then it builds itself up to district, and then regional, and then a national, or in this case, it's not a nation. They don't have a nation necessarily, but at the overall level, in mandated and elected delegates that then are recallable, consistently recallable, which of course is fundamentally important, and are answerable and mandated to those different assemblies. So it's confederated structures that go from the bottom up, and therefore everyone is controlled from that point on. Of course, that doesn't mean they don't have their own challenges. They also have made sure that all of these are gender representative. So in other words, nothing can move if there are not women that are involved at the very base of this, and everything is 50-50. In other words, any mandated representatives, all those that would represent their councils and their communes and others have to have equal gender representation. And in fact, there's a whole nother section of the movement, which is a women's only section, includes women defense forces and communes that are safe spaces and spaces where women themselves can be able to do other things that where men are not involved in this case. And at the heart of this Rojava revolution is that it is predominantly women-led, which is quite amazing in the context of a Middle Eastern situation, which is hugely patriarchal, and where the religious right wants to make mostly women go back into the domestic space and to become beholden to men, as is usually the case in most societies. They also have worker self-managed cooperatives that don't produce for profit, but produce for people's needs, that are part of the councils and the federated systems. As I said, everybody is recallable. They make their own decisions. They discuss constantly about those decisions. They're self-critical. In fact, the most amazing thing that when I was talking with these comrades, they said they have specific meetings that are just about looking in the mirror and being self-critical. What did we do wrong? How can we do it better? What do we need to do to improve? That's all that the agenda is. It's nothing about doing anything else. And I started chuckling. I said, if we had one of those meetings in South Africa that we would have among that, we'd be doing well. If we would dedicate it simply to being not in a negative way, but in a positive way about learning lessons and about correcting mistakes and about people being held accountable for if they're mandated to do certain things in that context. So these are, I'm rushing very quickly through these examples, and there's a lot more to be said that could be, and I'm sure there's many questions that would be raised in terms of all the different components of this. It's a lot more involved than I'm presenting here, but what the point is that there are examples as we speak of where people are creating structures, they're creating organizations, they're creating movements, they're creating economies, local economies, structures, communes, other kinds of things. They're egalitarian, that are gender equal, that are basically or attempting to be. It doesn't mean they're always getting it right or they don't have improvements to be made, and also are non-hierarchical in the sense of even though you do have to have people who take responsibility, that the way in which the organization is structured and the way in which it's built is that the pillars are truly from the bottom. They're not from the top. And it's not about coming down. It's about going the other way up. What we had talked about many times theoretically, but in practical terms have had a very, very difficult time implementing in South Africa, and for the most part, in movements and in political parties and other kinds of things. So here are living examples of democratic organization and egalitarian organizations that we can learn from. Doesn't mean that we can take everything. There are cultural specificities, there are religious specificities, there are other things that are going to be different from our own histories and others. But to learn and try to adapt, because my sense is, and I would think that this would be shared by a number of comrades who have been in the space and have been struggling for many, many years, is that we need to truly sit back and we need to be honest with ourselves. There is, we talk about the ANC and how it's been punished at the elections for not just its failure to deliver, but its arrogance of power. It became completely arrogant in power. But so too do individuals and do movements and leaders. They become arrogant in situations, or just because you think you have a particularly bright theory, or because you have a particular strong critique of the system and therefore have the answers. And I think we need to really, really adopt a lot of humility and step back and say, we are in a situation in South Africa where the other story of these elections is, and the electoral and political space, is that the left is nowhere to be seen. The left has disappeared fundamentally in this space. The right is taking the space. The more and more right wing is taking the space. And we've got to sort of, as opposed to, we need to do a critique of that right. 'Cause, 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 Sorry, my camera just decided to do something on its own there. I was going to just say that we need to be critical of that right, and we need to fight and defend the spaces for sure. But if we do not begin to start rethinking and recreating ourselves, we become irrelevant or increasingly irrelevant. And that's, I think, the reality of the situation here is that while, and here's the irony completely, is that as capitalism is more and more in crisis, and as people are more and more, I think more and more people are convinced that the system is not sustainable on a range of levels, both environmentally as well as economically and politically, progressive forces have largely, in most cases, and certainly in ours, have been unable to take that space and to convince people that there is something different, that we can build things, that we can do so in a democratic way, that we can do so in an egalitarian way, where ordinary people are listened to, where we don't have the big leaders, where we don't have everybody from the top. These are very, very difficult things to do, but they're possible. And we have historical experience, and we now have contemporary experience of examples of people doing these very things. Doesn't make it easy, but it makes it necessary. And I think that's what I wanted to put in front of us as in some ways, as a contribution. This is not new necessarily in the sense of people raising these kinds of things, but I think we're at a point right now in our history in South Africa where if we do not really, really start moving in a different direction around the way we build our own organizations, the way we run our own organizations, the kinds of relationships that we develop amongst each other, and in other words, building the kind of society we really would like to see inside in some ways, and having a way of trying to do things that is much more inclusive and much more tolerant. I think that we are going to find ourselves increasingly marginalized in political and social and other terms. So it's in a positive way to try to put these things and say, to encourage all of us to start not only looking at those examples, delving into them, discussing them, debating them, yes, having good arguments as well, which I think we've in some ways stopped doing. And oftentimes arguments turn into conflict when in fact arguments and debate are absolutely necessary forms of any democratic advance and building an organization that has the capability to be self-critical, but to be confident in what it's doing at the same time. So with those few words, and I think I've kept to my time, Comrade Chair. Hopefully, I will stop now, and we can engage. And as I said, this is just the beginning of I think the kinds of conversations we probably need to have and engagements we need to have. There's much out there. There's a lot of things to talk about and to be, but I do so in a spirit of comradeship, of inclusivity, of tolerance, irrespective of all the differences that we might have even on the left. And it's to say that if we do truly believe in what we say that we believe in, which is a system where people enjoy the basics of life, where people are equal, where we do not treat each other with lack of dignity and so forth, then we must practice that as much as we can, and we must try to build that where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale, for kickstarting this honest conversation. I'm sure other comrades in other spaces, they've also started, rethinking about the South African civil society. And I'm sure the comrades that are amongst with us today, they are also, encouraged by your talk. Okay, we'll go to the next section. Question and answer. I see, Shona, your hand is up. If you want to ask a question, Shona, you.
Sorry, Dan, I think you muted yourself when you were talking. I'm presuming you're saying I can ask my question?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thanks so much. Dale, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I wish that you could have talked for another couple of hours. Thank you. So Dale, I have two questions, if that's okay. if you, if Dan will allow me to ask 2 questions. The first is that I just wanted you to reflect on something that we did at the Center for Civil Society last year. We had a dialogue with 8 social justice campaigns who are like at the forefront of these struggles in South Africa. And within the dialogue, we asked this question: why is this dialogue amongst civil society activists, practitioners, if you want to call the NGOs that, why is this dialogue necessary? And I just want to read you some of the points that came out of there. And Dan was also there, so Dan can also join in here if he likes. Why is a dialogue amongst civil society important? Because we need to build civil society, we need to build power, right? That's how we're going to build it in that space. We need to envisage or reimagine a better solution, vision of the world. We need to facilitate a capable civil society. We need to self-reflect. Is civil society replicating the bad behavior of the state? Is it in this way taking agency away from people? Is civil society stuck? I think, this blends in with some of the things you were saying. And we need to reflect on funder politics and how these campaigns are funded. So the question that I have here for you is, do you think that the people who work in the civil society spaces, let me put it that way, in South Africa, do you think they are able to imagine a better vision of the world? Or do you think that there are such strong connections to what we see in spaces of politics where there's patronage politics? Do you it's all very well to say we need to build in that civil society space, but do you think that there is potential for reimagining things differently there? Because I feel that perhaps might be one of the challenges. And then my other question was related to some of the other work that I'm doing on civil society, where I use this term and I put a question mark at the end of it. Is the civil society space in South Africa shrinking? I've been criticized for arguing that it's shrinking because in some spaces it seems to be expanding, and other spaces it seems to be contracting. Certainly when you look at the rise of the right, it's expanding, Operation Dudula. So I guess what I'm wanting to ask here is, by failing to organize, do you think we are constricting the civic space ourselves, like people who work in civil society in whatever capacity? Is that a contribution to the way that space might be constricting? And then, as you said, the right is moving in and taking space. And I'll stop talking. Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, is there any other question from the audience?
I do see that there's some questions in the chat, by the way.
Oh, in the chat. Okay. Just to respond to Shona, and then we'll take the question in the chat box after you've
Sure. I mean, I think the answer to your first question, Shauna, which is obviously a fairly subjective one in terms of people being able to reimagine things differently in South Africa. Absolutely. I think we're more than capable of doing so. I think it's inevitable. In fact, I think it's just a question of time. And I particularly say this, and I say this with all humility, because I joked at the beginning that I'm coming from a more veteran or older generation. And I do think that the younger generation, those that are, particularly those that have been born in the last 30 years or so, who didn't come with all of that baggage of, who is Lenin and Trotsky and Marx and this and all of the different kinds of positionalities and everything else. I think their ability to reimagine is much more intense and much greater, possibly, than the older generation, which has a difficulty jettisoning some of that baggage, because it's all they know. It's almost as if, we just some people just do the same things again and again and again, hoping for a different result. But the last 30 years has proven otherwise. So my answer to your question is yes, I do believe the challenge is to create the spaces, and this goes to you're mentioning about the dialogue. Is that let me give an example of where and this again is not necessarily new, but I think we just have to be able to put these things front and center. So sort of say, okay, so what can we start doing now? So for example, not just internally within the South African space, but regionally as well, where other civil society organizations are facing exactly the same things that we are, have been facing them, and have been facing a lot of other things that we will start facing, for example, like really serious political repression, I think, which is going to be coming soon in our space. And yet we don't talk to each other. We don't create a lot of spaces to be able to learn from each other. We don't do this. And what we love to do, it seems, on the left, is to hold conferences and big events and to get together for 3 or 4 days, come up with a whole range of resolutions and other things, and then we might not see each other for years or months again, and these things sort of die on the vine. So I think in some ways, and everybody has talked about over the years about the lack of a national movement that brings people together. I don't think those things are created because a few individuals are going to call a meeting or call I think what is absolutely necessary is us to go back to the basics, where we are in building from that bottom. So when things begin to happen in Durban, when things begin to happen in the Eastern Cape, when things begin to happen in Johannesburg with all sorts of different kinds of communities and activities and struggles begin to happen and people start putting things onto the agenda, that tends, in my experience, that tends to create a momentum that can allow people to start talking with you. We saw this within the COVID-19 situation, where people began to come together, not because there was any big structure, because anybody had thought about this, but because people were doing similar things and beginning to understand that there were those connectivities. So I think we have to be patient. Sometimes we want to build something, we want it now, and if it doesn't work, well, then it's not, we have this impatience about building organization, about building structures from the bottom up, which takes time. And this is the lesson. Let me give an example. The Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party being the latest example in the last elections, which declared itself, had a manifesto, and got 11,000 votes in the national. Because why? Because there's no groundwork that was done. There was no convincing of people. There is no organic process. And I think that's what we have to do. And I would agree that we are more than capable of doing it and reimagining in the process. So it's not about having all the ideas set and down on paper, and this is what we must do, we must follow steps 1 to 20. It's in learning and doing that we then find the different ways to do that. And I think that's where goes into your second question, which is that where I think we fall in the civil society or fallen short, should we say. I think there's a lot of good things that happen. It's not to be too critical in this sense. There's a lot of people out there that are working really hard, that are doing some incredible work. But where we could possibly improve these things and move it in a different direction is where we begin to have joint practical things together. We tend to do joint sort of meetings and conferences and these kinds of things, but joint activities. And instead of being this sort of territorial kind of, this is my space, this is your space, you hold to your lane, I'll do my thing. And that comes into the funding because people are competing for different funds in different spaces. And so we therefore we silo ourselves. And again, this critique has been made. It's not new, but I think the answer to moving beyond that is this in practice, in struggle, finding new ways of doing things through civil society. And that's where, as opposed to, simply just having events and these things, I think that would be my response. I know I don't want to go on for too long, but thank you. I see there's quite a few comments or questions. I don't know, Dan, if you want me to address some of these or if you want to raise them specifically.
No, you can address them as if you can see them on your side. Let's make it organic.
Yeah, so I think
I think Mark has a question there, and after you've addressed Mark's question, I will take. I think there is one hand. I think it's Ben. Ben, you can go after when Dale has addressed Mark's question, then you can ask your question, Ben. You can go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to quickly address Michael's point around the Kurdish. You've been active in the Kurdish Solidarity Campaign, and the relationship with the United States. Look, there's always contradictions in these kinds of things, and it's not of your own making. Obviously, in this case, in northeastern Syria, where when Islamic State started trying to take over and everything else, of course, the self-defense units, the YPG, the women as well as the men and others began to fight back, and the only space that they at that particular point that they could get weapons and other things from in this case was the United States, not because the U.S. was interested in their struggles or in anything they were doing, but simply as a means of trying to defeat ISIS in this case. And that is a complication. But I would argue from everything that I've seen from comrades who've been there, from others who are there, is that they're trying to move beyond that, even though, so for example, the United States has left the Kurdish with trying to guard 15,000 prisoners from ISIS, and mostly women and children, and nobody is talking about this. Nobody is trying to assist them in any particular way. And then, of course, 5 years later, when ISIS then begins to reappear, and because people are going to say, oh, how did that happen? So in some ways, I think where the weakness is opposed to saying for the United States, it's international solidarity. Is that, when the Spanish Revolution, when many other international, the Zapatistas, others that came, those kinds of international, there are many people that are going to Rojava to help out with its education, agriculture, and other things. And I think that's what we must try to do. And the only way to move beyond some of those contradictions, which are always going to be there, is to build more of what is good. And I think in that case, they're trying their best to do it in very, very difficult circumstances. The question about Mark about how to engage those on the left who claim to have the positions, but they practice undemocratic politics. Do we engage with tolerance? How we fuse? I think there comes a point in time, yes, we try. I think everybody must try to engage comrades, irrespective of our differences. But there does come a point in time where we need to move, where just arguing for argument's sake and fighting, again, the same battles again and again and again, where comrades just simply don't want to, you've seen the movie Jurassic Park. Well, oftentimes, I think sometimes that quite a lot of the left inhabits that park. And that they just simply do not want to get past because they're uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them, they don't know. It's unpredictable. You don't have the command of the language or the command of the ideas, new ideas and things. You just have read lots of Marx and Lenin and the old guys and everybody else, and you know that, and you keep repeating it. So I think at some point, it's not about, you leave those fights and you go and you move and you build things. That's where I think in a more positive way. So try to engage, move, but if it's not possible, move on and get on with the business of trying to do, I think, what comrades feel is necessary to do to build, because we cannot always, whether it's on the left or any other ideological spectrum, always be held by those that want to basically, this is the irony, we talk about maintaining the economic and capitalist status quo, and yet on the left, oftentimes there's those that want to maintain the left status quo that has been there for the last 70 years in some ways, and not to be able to be creative in different ways. So I would say that's how we should respond to it. I think Maki's comment about our own worst enemies, we tend to harbor the right of marginalizing each other. Yes. Let me just say this on a very personal basis, and I think this is the other weakness that we have, is that sometimes we separate the personal and the political. We think that our organizational, our political life is here and our personal life is here. And comrades, I have to say this, from my experience as well. And let me just be, I'm bringing you into my world. I'm 4 years of post-stage 4 cancer, almost on the verge of dying 4 years ago. And here I am, here we are. And as opposed to keeping that to myself and having this as an individual struggle, I told every single comrade and friend that I knew that was close to me about my cancer, and that I needed assistance and I needed help. And I wanted to build a kind of community that would allow me to get through this if they were willing. And they were. It was an amazing journey. It's what got me through, despite, all the medical stuff. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that if we start treating each other, even though, just like a family, we might argue, we might not agree on things, but if we treat each other as a community, as friends, as true comrades, and really that meaning, then we can build the kind of politics, the organizations that flow from that. if we're always constantly fighting and trying to prove our point and trying to get one over on the other person and trying to say we're better than you and out-recruit this, as Maki said, we're going to be, if comrades do not take seriously our own personal contradictions, we're always going to make mistakes. We're always going to be, in a situation. But let me give an example where, in the case of several organizations I belong to, where men who sexually harassed and in one case raped a woman, right? And most other movements would say, let's deal with this internally. Let's deal with this. This is a comment. No, you must bring it right up to the top. You must be totally honest about this. People must be punished for those kinds of things. There's no getting around those things. We cannot have double standards that we apply to one set of and not to ourselves. And I think when we begin to do that, people take us seriously. People who have rejected the left message and anti-capitalist message, oftentimes I ask them, well, why is it? Is it the idea? They was like, no. They say oftentimes it's the people. They say one thing and they do another. We don't believe in them anymore, just like they don't believe in the ANC anymore. People are, so we must practice what we preach, and I think that's the point there. I'll stop there. I know there's many others. Maybe Ben has another question. Thank you.
Ben, join the conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dale, for your presentation. No, I want to comment and maybe some question. Left is nowhere to be found during these elections. Left parties. I remember you talked about Social Revolutionary Party, where it was led by Ivan Jim, and he was leading a political union formation. So that talk to the issue you touch, which talk about leaders who are what you call big man politics. In this country we have that problem of big man politics. The politics of the left, it seems as if it's not going nowhere based on this syndrome of big man's politics. They don't want to collude and work together, and you find your unions forming alliance with political parties that are not leaning to the left. And then this issue of reimagining things in terms of politics, in political space and also in civil society is something that needs to be taken seriously, especially in this time. Now we are going to a stage where there's a talk of coalition governments, and people who voted have no say in that. In terms of those agreements, it goes to the issue of constituency-based electoral system, where it is difficult for citizens to recall politicians because politicians have more power, political parties have no power, people have no power anymore now. If you vote, you just donating your vote for your political party can do as they please after that. So really, we are caught in the middle where the sooner we start realizing that we must claim our power, the better for all of us. That's where I see that there's an urgency that we need to do something around that thing of trying to come together as people who believe in the left and try to work together in the interest of all South Africans. Thank you, Comrade.
Sure, Ben. Thanks for those comments. I think I don't know if I have much to add on that, but I wanted to take Lubna. Thank you for your comment in the chat, and I wanted to pick up maybe as the last point because I know we're just about out of time. Because Lubna raises this, when there are this, when you try to change things, people don't listen. It breaks relationships. It breaks movements. I joke, and also we must rediscover our sense of humor. I think in many cases, sometimes I go into meetings of left comrades, and I think everybody is depressed and dour and so serious about everything that we can't enjoy things. But I think we have to laugh at ourselves in some cases, and in this case, I just wanted to relate my own personal experience of being involved in movements that exactly where that happened, where they basically destroyed themselves from within as a result of these very things that we're talking about. And how do we deal with that? Well, it might sound very simplistic, but in some ways I think it is still appropriate, which is that we build something new. If we cannot, and I think this is where we are. I think this is where we are. If we can't continue to go back. It's like essentially you know, a situation where if you're in a relationship and it's abusive relationship, whether that's emotional abuse, physical abuse, or whatever kind of abuse it is, and you keep going back into the same relationship again and again in the hope that it's going to change, but it doesn't, well, eventually something really bad's probably going to happen there. So in many cases, I think that the lesson applies is that when we have had a space which is become so toxic or so debilitating or so conflictual that this becomes very negative and holds you back and holds us back, then we create those things. There are a whole generation of people out there waiting for something else. They understand that what we've had in front of us is not sustainable. It's not good. It's not, but it's not about us offering the total vision. Here we are, come join us. It's about creating the spaces where people can then imagine what could be done and trying to find ways to do that. And I'm fairly convinced that it's going to be mostly new people, not the old lefties, not the old. I personally am willing and am ready to step out of the way and try to help where I can, but not be at the forefront anymore. We must be humble. We must also realize that we can facilitate certain things, but oftentimes it's not our space to lead or to be in the forefront. And we need to let others, and particularly the younger generation and those with new ideas. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years from people that are half my age on a range of different things and that I thought I never would, precisely just to be open to those possibilities and then to see new things that can be built, new organizations, new movements, new struggles, new ways of doing things. I'm optimistic that we can do this. We just have to have the will to do that. And I think we can. And I know some of us are tired and we're feeling quite beaten down sometimes, but if the other side of that is that these possibilities do exist, and if we orient ourselves towards those possibilities, I have no doubt in my mind that we will energize ourselves and that we'll be able to see and build new things that over time that can have a real impact and can change not only our local world, but in a broader sense. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dale. I think it's 2 p.m. on my clock, so I think we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for offering us with such wisdom. I think we will take it back to our spaces and maybe rethink about our movements and about our lived experiences as comrades in the struggle. So we thank you so much. Shona, if you can maybe
Thanks so
give
much,
a vote of thanks. Okay.
Dale, thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for participating. And there were some really rich comments also in the comments box. I was just looking at that. So hopefully you all have a chance to have a squiz through that before you leave. So thanks to all of you for participating. Dale, that was really great. Really good to engage with you again. Just to let you know that we are lucky to be having 2 seminars from Dale. So we're also going to be engaging with Dale next Wednesday, same place, same time, same platform. And next Wednesday, Dale is going to be breaking down the pillars of neoliberalism in South Africa. The political, socioeconomic, and organizational pillars of neoliberalism in South Africa is what the seminar is termed. So I think that's another really critical discussion for the kind of work that's going on in civil society. So please join us again next week. All the best to everybody. Go well. Dale, I just wanted to make a comment about your health. I think you are looking in very good health and full of beans, and I'm very pleased. So good recovery. Well done. And yes, we hope to see you all next week. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Dan. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale.